The open world map is among the most contentious parts of Elden Ring's design, leading to a lot of differing opinions on it. Did the game ultimately suffer due to being open world? Was the map size perfectly fine? Or could it be even bigger? Should the game have ended at Leyndell Royal Capital? Should Elden Ring not have been open world at all? In this video, I would like to analyze all these perspectives and more. I want to start by saying that on a personal level, I don't have anything against open worlds. A couple of my favorite games ever made are open world, despite their occasional flaws. And as a matter of fact, I quite enjoy playing most of them without fast traveling. The point of this video is more so about putting into perspective some of the major complaints against the open world map FromSoft decided to employ in Elden Ring, but I will be examining both sides of the argument. Let's start by looking at why a game would be open world to begin with. There's two main reasons the developer would choose to go for an open world map format. The first one is to allow the freedom to choose in what order and how you wish to tackle things. The second is to have more open lands with less focus on level design and more on realistic environments. The former was already possible in a good chunk of the prior games. The only real exceptions were Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3, where you're mostly tunneled through a predetermined path for a good chunk of the game. Of course, Elden Ring has an even bigger degree of freedom for this, but we'll discuss that more in depth later. The how is what's more expanded in this game, with stealth being a more refined aspect, with the open world often allowing you to approach camps and the like from different angles, instead of being tunneled into a certain approach by the level design, etc. The latter I don't think entirely applies to these games. I believe most of them do a good job at making it feel like you're in a realistic place, with one noteworthy exception. Only they do obviously take a lot from fantasy in their creation of the worlds. Demon's Souls is especially noteworthy, with their touch of realism to pretty much all of the locales. And the fact that the areas aren't directly connected also makes it to where it doesn't feel like the world is forced together for video game convenience. These places are as far away as a mining tunnel would be from a royal palace in real life. The real reason for them wanting to do open world is just to try it out. Miyazaki has been asked a few questions about the open world in interviews, and he stated that he simply thinks that the open world format really lends itself to individual experiences, like seeing something in a distance and wanting to explore it. This isn't a new feeling he wants to convey. He's mentioned in interviews about Dark Souls 3 that if you can see something in the distance, you can go there. So in reality, this game is simply a different way to approach that same feeling. He's also mentioned that he's played a few open world games that he's enjoyed, like Skyrim, Witcher 3, and Breath of the Wild. Nevertheless, he stated no particular game had an overt impact on the designing of Elden Ring, simply that he enjoyed them. But this likely made him consider it as a new backdrop for the next big project. With all this in mind, let's discuss the successes and failures in Elden Ring's open world map. First by discussing how the open world fares in a first playthrough. Let's start by examining the perspective that a lot of Souls veterans came into the game with. A lot of us who have become versed in the series enjoy exploring every nook and cranny of the games, because level design and exploration are some of the things that Fromsoftware excels at, especially given that there was no division between a level and the world of the game. Even most hallways between major areas have some degree of level design. While Elden Ring's legacy dungeons are just as good as anything FromSoft has put out in the past, there's definitely a major divide between a level and the open world map. And exploring the open world is where things start getting overwhelming. For convenience, let's call this type of player the completionist. If you intend to explore every bit of the game, you'd easily spend well above 100 hours and likely would still miss a lot of things. That's not to say we mind missing things, but it's more likely that you have more on your plate that you can even handle. So add on top of that things that you didn't find to begin with, and it can become a lot. Factor in that catacomb levels and some of the caves feel repetitive and underwhelming, and throw in the surprise addition of the mountaintops of the giants when the game leads you to believe that Leyndell is the end of the game, and there's a very high likelihood that unless you spread out your playing across several weeks or months, you'll end up very burnt out. I should point out that the repetitiveness is intentional. Every time you find ruins in the overworld, you know there will be a basement where you can find a boss and or item as a reward. Every time you find a dungeon, you know there will be a boss at the end that will give you some reward. This is the crux of what a gameplay loop is. But admittedly, it's a little bit of a surprise seeing this in a FromSoftware game quite so obviously. It essentially results in a lot of areas being explored and tackled the same way and only having superficial differences. From the completionist standpoint, I hope you can see why it can be a tiresome endeavor. It's hard to appreciate the intricacies of FromSoft's level design when you're encountered by dungeon after dungeon that often ends up blending together to begin with, and a map that feels like it never ends. This ultimately ended up taking away from one of the major reasons people appreciate these games. On the flip side, it's important to consider that the developers likely don't intend you to come every inch of the map in your first playthrough. And I think that's probably a sound assumption. This game doesn't fall into the usual open world nonsense of having markers all over the map telling you where you need to explore. There's no stupid map discovery percentage to be found anywhere. There's no checklist of things to do. And if you want to take this as another sign pointing to that, the achievement list doesn't require you to kill all the bosses in the game or find every location. It primarily wants you to kill the major bosses, some other highlight ones, get some special items, get 3 different endings, and that's it. Pretty much just seeing most of the noteworthy content and not every individual dungeon. I think this is most likely the intention of the developers, but there's 2 little issues. 1, you never know what kind of equipment you can find in any given dungeon or area. For instance, one of the most popular weapons in the game, Moonveil, is just in a random cave in Caelid. There's no way to predict that that'll be the case. It's a magic katana and it's just in a cave in a region that's associated with a rod. A more logical place to find it would be somewhere in Liurnia, or at the very least Celia if it has to be in Caelid. So if you were a sorcerer or a magic damage focused character, you would know this is a place you want to check. As it is now, you would have to know where it is, or explore very random locations to find a good item that might fit your character. Of course, this encourages repeat playthroughs and such, but my point is more so that in general, some item locations don't match where you expect them to be. And if you're not exploring the whole map, you're likely to miss things that fit your build. And 2, Miyazaki said in an interview that he thinks this game would take 30 hours without a lot of detours. Now there's a few caveats to that statement that make it make more sense, but I hope you had the same reaction I had when I first heard this. The first one is the one I already mentioned, that this is only taking into account the main story. This could theoretically be possible, but on a first playthrough where you only have a vague idea of where to go, and with not getting a lot of levels as you ignore a ton of content, and don't know how to build a good character, I just can't see it when reaching the endgame bosses. If I had to give a rough estimate even with that in mind, I would set 50 hours as a high bar, likely more around 60 or 70 on average. Of course, another aspect of that is that he is the game director, so obviously he knows how the game goes. And the interview happened in mid-2021, so the game wasn't quite finished yet. Either way, you can see how that might give the wrong idea as well. Even if it's a factor outside the game, that shouldn't necessarily impact your final impression of it. All in all, if you thoroughly enjoyed the open world format of this game, and you didn't find yourself getting exhausted by it, I'm very much happy for you, but just due to the nature of every game they've done thus far, Fromsoftware certainly carried some expectations that perhaps weren't met to fans of the series. Of course, to some degree perhaps that was our fault for expecting so, but just like people who enjoy open worlds may like this game for what it is, people who like the more concise experience that the older games provide certainly are allowed to dislike this setup. Okay, let's now look at how the game handles on repeat playthroughs. I don't think I'd have to elaborate much on why the replayability of this game wouldn't be much better for completionists. The playstyle of liking to explore every nook and cranny of the prior games was likely developed from playing and replaying most of them a ton, so it may have not even been how a lot of us started, just how it ended up forming. But as a result, replaying this game with the same mentality likely won't change your perspective of it. The length of the prior games significantly reduced the more you learn about them, so replaying them often isn't more than a 20-hour experience tops to complete if you know what you're doing, but still taking your time. Of course, that does extend to Elden Ring as well, but it still likely fall in the 50+ hour range to complete entirely. However, that leads into something I think is an undeniable strength of Elden Ring's layout. Only doing the content you want to do. The freedom to only do the content that you wish to do in Elden Ring is unmatched in the rest of the series. Demon's Souls, despite being a very open game after doing 1-1, still requires you to do every single area without exception. I don't think the game suffers as a result of this, as it's a very short experience, but you are required to do all areas and bosses if playing as intended. Dark Souls is pretty good about allowing you to do the 2 Bells of Awakening and the Lord Soul bosses at any order that you want, but the only areas that you can truly skip are Undead Burg, the Depths, Darkroot Basin, and the Valley of Drakes. And they're relatively small areas, especially the last 2, which are more or less transition areas. Dark Souls 2 I'm not as versed in, so forgive me if I'm wrong here, but from what I remember in looking at a map, it seems that you can only really skip Hyde's Tower of Flame and No Man's Wharf if you get to the Lost Bastille from Cardinal Tower, but the Cardinal Tower itself is still required due to the giant memories. I could go on, but the rest of the games don't look much different, and Bloodborne and Dark Souls 3 are the most linear of the games, so they don't get better in this regard. In contrast, of course you only need to kill any 2 Shard Bearers in Elden Ring, and you can proceed to the mid-game. And that certainly makes it remarkable to replay if you're willing to completely toss out the idea of completing the game and only do the content you want to do yourself. So if you don't care about doing all the content, or even all the Shard Bearers, you can choose to skip them. Don't care for Rykard or the Volcano Manor? Skip it. Underground map doesn't do it for you? Skip it. Don't eat anything in Weeping Peninsula? Skip it. Don't like Liurnia? Uh-oh. Here's something I mentioned in one of my latest videos, and I want to expand on it more, since I only mentioned it as a footnote essentially. Even though you can't skip Rennala, if you have no interest or need anything in Liurnia, you will spend a long time just riding your horse to make your way to the Altus Plateau. I went out of my way to time it. From the moment you get the Liurnia the Lakes prompt to the moment you touch the Dectus elevator, It's just under 6 minutes of nothing but going on your horse through a relatively eventless area if you're running to the lake bit. This is also assuming you don't want to stop for any graces along the way, or don't want to pick up any of the secret tiers. Though 2 of them are on this path, one of them is one of the more tedious to collect. That's actually another one of my pet peeves about this game. I don't like that there's only exactly 12 sacred tiers in this game. I really think they should have given you more than you need, like with the golden seeds. And they could have been in tricky places to get or something. But having to go to every specific location just for the sacred tiers is tedious after a while. Anyway, this is a bare minimum of 6 minutes of not engaging with the game in any significant way, besides avoiding lobsters and trebuchet shots. Likely more around 8 minutes or so for graces, 10 to 12 best case scenario if you want to get the 3 sacred tiers here. Even if you did want to do Renala, given that she has the respec mechanic, the Legacy Dungeon of Raya Lucaria is probably the weakest one in the game, being incredibly linear and not super interesting. It certainly would have helped if at least Caelid was also connected to Altus, so you didn't have to take the same path every time. The worst part about the really lengthy region? This isn't even the worst example of it in the game. After Leyndell and Morgott is when a lot of things fall apart. The ability to skip content is no longer an option. You are forced to go through Mountaintop of the Giants, Farum Azula, and the Ashen Capital, where there's that ungodly 3-boss gauntlet with nothing in between. As with most games, you can tell that the deadline started to pressure Fromsoft, and as a result, the endgame suffered for it. Mountaintop is incredibly barren compared to pretty much all the areas prior to this, only matched by the other snowy area. Farum Azula is great, just probably developed completely separately from the open world map, so it might have not been affected as severely. Ashen Capital likely was affected. It's possible that the idea of having a very plain area covered in ash with not much to see was intended from the beginning. And it's a very novel idea, so it doesn't bother me personally, but the boss gauntlet still makes me think that it was rushed in some ways. Back to the mountaintops, I speedrun across this area as well. From Forbidden Lands Grace to the Fog Gate of Fire Giant, it was a 7.5 minute run. Add the graces and all that stuff, and of course it inflates it further. Spending this much time in any game where you're not really doing anything worthwhile would be unacceptable. Even the prior games, even though getting from one area to another takes more time, usually there's obstacles along the way, enemies to fight, or even running around them, but it's not nearly as mindless as this. And for other open world games, you could argue this could be an issue there too, but a lot of those have a much bigger emphasis on roleplaying and the like, or have faster ways to get about even if you haven't been there, like the carriages in Skyrim. If you don't think Liurnia is an issue, sure, but Mountaintops is definitely worse. And given that you have to go through here in every playthrough, I'm sure some of y'all have felt how tedious it is to get through here on your pre-playthroughs. Or even on first playthrough. I've definitely heard from a lot of folks that they thought the game should have ended at Leyndell. I'll discuss that idea a little further into the video. While we're talking about the misused areas in replayability, I want to quickly look at Weeping Peninsula. I think this area works perfectly as an extended tutorial and the like, but I'm also a little sad that there's not much reason to come here and replay. As it is now, the only reason to come here is if you just happen to need some weapon or equipment here, or if you want the sacred tiers. To piggyback off what I said earlier, I think the sacred tiers were misused a bit here as well. I understand that Weeping Peninsula is a good place to find sacred tiers, but it's definitely not the best use of one's time if that's the only noteworthy thing to get here. There certainly should have been a shard bearer at least connected to this area somehow, or at least a major boss of some sort, remembrance or not. Perhaps it didn't have to be in the actual overworld if they strictly wanted it to be a tutorial expansion, but maybe they could have had a smaller underground segment like Mogwen that held something important. As it is now, it just feels like a waste of an area on repeat playthroughs. The last point I want to look at for the replayability is the build variety. This is almost single-handedly what made me personally go straight into my second playthrough of Elden Ring after I thought I was burnt out and needed a break after my first playthrough. After seeing all the spells and weapon options in the game, there were too many abilities I had, and it's by far one of the best aspects of this game. However, it's not only the variety itself, but how the game allows you to build your character. Elden Ring is much like Dark Souls 1, in that if you want to create your build as fast as possible, you can generally make a beeline to whatever you need right out of the tutorial. For one example, go into the weapons segment of the Dark Souls 1 wiki and simply look for yourself how many weapons you can get before you place Lord Vessel. It's about 95% or so. Even if you move back the goalpost and put it before in Orlando, it's probably still around 70%, which is still very impressive. If you look at Elden Ring, of course the percentage likely isn't as high, but take it from someone who has made around 15 builds for this game and played with a ton of different combinations of weapons and spells. There was almost always options for my selected element or playstyle spread out throughout the game before you need to enter Leyndell. The only build of mine that I found tedious to collect things for was a Bloodflame build, as a lot of the spells of that variety are locked behind Leyndell, or have difficult requirements, like beating Rio Moga early. That aside, it's still very approachable for nearly any build you'd want. which certainly can't be said for all prior games, especially the linear ones. If you try to do an arcane or blood-tinged build that isn't gun related in Bloodborne, you'll be shit out of luck until after Amelia, or maybe even later. For the last bit of the video, let's answer those questions I posted in the beginning more directly. Did the game suffer from being open world? Certainly in some ways, yes, especially in first playthrough. It has a lot of problems with repetition that weren't really an issue in the prior games, along with not having as much concise level design. Most of the really marvelous level design is seen in the legacy dungeons, and aside from that, it's rare to see any major highlights. The minor legacy dungeons are hit or miss, only a few of them were real standouts. The rest were using ladders and rooms set up in different ways. There's also a couple of catacombs and caves that have some really cool layouts and ideas, but they get heavily overshadowed by the lackluster ones. This is not to say it's not a good game still. I think the problem lies more in transitioning the prior formula so directly and only putting an open world in the middle of all the areas, with all the bloating of content that comes with it. It's certainly not the first open world to struggle with it, feeling like the map was designed first or early on, then spending time trying to fill it out with content, instead of building around the content. It definitely overstayed its welcome in a lot of ways. Should the game have ended at Leyndell, or could the map be bigger? If I were to make some sort of executive decision, I wouldn't end the game at Leyndell personally. It would almost be a shame if we didn't get a snowy area in a FromSoft game, and perhaps this is why it's extra disappointing that mountaintops almost felt like an afterthought, because those areas tend to be real highlights. Perhaps making it mandatory harmed it a bit, along with having two snowy areas instead of maybe pulling them together, and simply making Castle Sol the gateway into Helix instead of Ardina. Even if it requires adjusting it in some way, if you don't want to make it as easy to get to as simply beating Commander Nile. It actually feels like this was the plan at first, given the Helix tree is more visible from Castle Sol than from Ardina, but that's besides the point. Just as food for thought, what I would do is cut chunks of the Liurnia segment, making it a little more similar in size to the other major regions. And these bits are what I have in mind. I think even with these cuts, it still feels like a massive lake, but make it more palatable to explore and or to run through. And for mountaintops, I would cut the long bridge area with the golem shooting you, and the entirety of the flame peak. The bridge is a fine set piece, but I don't think it ultimately adds much. And it's definitely not original. Flame peak is just... there's nothing there! It's a waste of an area, the only dungeon in it isn't even on the actual peak, it just leads back to the beginning of mountaintops, which is a cool idea, but it could have been done without the flame peak. With these changes I think this area would be better at least. Perhaps not perfect, but it's a start. As for whether it could be bigger, where do you draw the line? I do get the impression that FromSoft only made this map as big as they thought it should be, and perhaps didn't get the chance to make all of them as interesting as each other. And I imagine in some regions they might have felt like it was too big as well in hindsight, though that's pure speculation on my part. I don't think this is a common sentiment, by the way, about the map being bigger. It's just one I saw in an offhand comment in one of my videos, and I thought it was important to discuss, even if only like 2 people think this. And finally, to answer the big question of the video, should have Elden Ring been open world? In my opinion, absolutely yes. With all I've said today, you may have expected me to say that they would have been better off making another game in the standard Soulsborne format. But here's 2 reasons why, to me, none of them matter. Let me read a quote to you. This is from an interview Miyazaki had about how he came on as a director of Demon Souls. Demon Souls wasn't doing well. The project had problems, and the team had been unable to create a compelling prototype. But when I heard it was a fantasy action role-playing game, I was excited. I figured if I could find a way to take control of the game, I could turn it into anything I wanted. Best of all, if my ideas failed, nobody would care. It was already a failure. Miyazaki and his team essentially had the freedom to make whatever their hearts desired, as if they were an indie game studio, but with the funds of something bigger, and thus were able to put together the ambitious and innovative game that was Demon Souls. Of course, the circumstances of both games couldn't be more different. FromSoft is a very established developer now, that probably has more of a design by committee approach than they used to, that has millions of fans waiting with bated breath for the next game. But there's also a reason this game isn't Dark Souls 4, or anything else directly attached to an existing series. As someone who wants to design their own game one day, nothing would be more disheartening to me than being forced to make a game I didn't want to make. So plain and simple, if an open world game is what FromSoft and Miyazaki wanted to make, more power to them. They have the right to try out something new. Did they make some missteps, especially when looking at the open world? Absolutely. And if they were to make a sequel of this game, or try it again at a later date, I would certainly hope that they took a look in hindsight at what could have been improved or done differently. But even so, this was still a marvelous game, and challenged some established open world game tropes that have infested the industry. It would be ignorant to think this game is on the same level as those. As of writing of this video, we still only have a PNG of the DLC and nothing else. Perhaps they will apply a lot of these improvements into the expansion's map in a micro level. FromSoft's DLC tend to be of high quality, and generally are completely disconnected from the main map, so they don't need to be held back by any restrictions of the lands between. Almost anything is possible, and I'm certainly looking forward to seeing how they fare. And reason 2, the older games aren't going anywhere. If you're already a fan of Fromsoftware, I would hope you already have access to them and are able to replay whenever you wish. We have plenty of games to go back to, even though the odds that you like all of them equally is low, due to how different they are from one another. If FromSoft starts going to the direction of only open world games and doesn't learn from some of their mistakes, perhaps you can reevaluate this stance in the future. But as it stands, that's not necessarily the fault of Elden Ring. On a personal level, although I prefer a lot of the previous games over Elden Ring, I certainly still mostly enjoy the format and don't mind that they tried it. I do admit that part of me would have been worried that if they did make a more traditional Soulsborne game, it would have come out like Dark Souls 3, where the game is too painfully linear for me. But perhaps the existence of Sekiro and how they handled the exploration there would have been some reassurance. All in all, as much as I am a Soulsborne veteran myself, I also understand that business-wise, you always want to bring in new fans. And occasionally that means that the games have to evolve in some ways that could leave older fans behind. It's only a little sad that it seems FromSoftware has forgotten some very important lessons along the way to accomplish that. Alright, that was the video. This one was a bitch to make. I'm sure it wouldn't even be that long once it's done. But for one, I get insane writer's block trying to write the script for it. Like, I knew what I wanted to say. I was just having problems putting it down into a freaking doc and then arranging it and how I wanted to say all the things I needed to say. And then after that, because I'm trying to be more mindful about how I enunciate and stuff, recording the script took 2.5 hours. 9 pages. It's not even that bad. But despite all that, I'm glad I got this done. This kind of video is the most along the lines of what I want to discuss in my channel. I love game design and breaking it down. As I mentioned earlier, I do want to make games one day. So just learning and analyzing games is something I really enjoy. And I think my last 2 videos hopefully opened up a path for me to be able to do that a little bit more. And I certainly would be very happy if it kept going this direction and it goes well and I can even expand to maybe a few different games. So I do hope you enjoyed that and I hope that it does well. I'm still definitely planning on finishing some of the projects from before, like the 1.0 and callback series. But the 1.0 specifically, I realize it's going to take me a lot longer than expected, and I'm probably not going to have it done by the end of August. Ideally, it will be done in September, but we will see. And this is supposed to be a video I thought I could get done relatively quickly in between as I try to finish that up. But alas, it turned out to be a massive headache. Here's hoping I'm getting more writer's block on anything I work on coming forward. But yeah. I would like to thank my members for supporting the channel. I recently kind of relaunched that because I made a few changes and I'm actually going to start doing incentives for them. So if you want to support me and this channel, consider becoming a member yourself. And if you like this kind of video, I would hopefully have more of those in the future. There's at least 1 or 2 that I'm already considering doing in the near future. But for now, I do have the other 2 things that some games are better than others. Those were the ones I was referring to. And the compiled version of the 1.0 series video is getting done now, but the whole series is already done. Just need to rework some beginning bits. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I hope to see you again. Bye-bye.